The 10th year of being with Alexander Adams had become a string of sacrifices, but this one cut the deepest. My mother was gravely ill, her frail body battling time itself. Her only wish was to see me married and personally oversee the ceremony that would seal my happiness. For this dream, I humbled myself, pleading with Alexander 99 times before he finally agreed to a wedding. His reluctance, though sharp, was overshadowed by my mother's joy. Despite her failing strength, she climbed Everwood Summit, step by agonizing step, and prayed to God to safeguard our future. Desperate for guidance, she turned to a mystic to divine the perfect moment to act, trusting that timing held the key to our salvation. She spent countless sleepless nights, her one hand trembling, embroidering a love knot symbolizing eternal devotion. But just 3 days before the wedding, Alexander shattered everything. He stood before me, unyielding, his tone devoid of warmth. Madeline's birthday happens to fall on the same day. We 11 have to postpone the wedding. I collapsed to my knees, my voice trembling with desperation. This date was chosen by someone my mother trusted. She's holding on with all her strength just to see this day. Her birthday will come again next year, but my mom doesn't have that kind of time. He barely spared me a glance, his attention consumed by choosing the perfect cake for Madeline Landers. What does it matter to me if your mom lives or dies, he said coldly. Even if she's truly at death's door, she can wait until Madeline finishes celebrating her one birthday. After delivering those cruel words, Alexander walked away with his childhood sweetheart, leaving without a backward glance. Left in despair, I resolved to move on, choosing a partner who truly deserved to stand by my side in marriage. On the day of her birthday, Alexander's paranoia got the better of him. He seemed convinced I would cause some sort of disruption, and made sure his assistant kept a vigilant eye on me. The assistant convinced him, "Sir, you don't need to worry. Miss Carter is getting married today, there's no way she has time to cause any trouble in the dimly lit hospital room." My mother sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the embroidered love knot in her frail hands. Her trembling fingers repeatedly moved one over the stitches, searching for flaws she could no longer see. The cancer had cruelly spread to her brain, stealing her vision bit by bit. Each misstep in her stitching forced her to undo and redo her work, her determination unbroken by the pain racking her fragile body. Despite endless sleepless nights caused by the agony, she always smiled when she reached out to touch my head. "It's such a blessing to see my baby so happy," she whispered. "I can leave this world without regret." Her words struck a chord deep within me, and the tears I had held back for so long threatened to spill. Before they betrayed me, I hurried out of the room, feigning an excuse. Once outside, I unlocked my phone, my hands shaking. The screen lit up with a message from Alexander. His words were cold and curt, informing me that the one wedding was postponed. Gripping the phone like a lifeline, I sank to the ground, biting into my hand to stifle the sobs that surged from my chest. Hot tears streamed down my face as the muffled groans of my mother's pain seeped through the thin hospital door. Wiping my face with trembling hands, I stood up, my resolve hardening. Without hesitation, I called Alexander. Standing at the doorway of the private room, the soft melody of a love song floated to my ears. I didn't need to peek inside to know Alexander and Madeline were singing together. Summoning every ounce of courage, I pushed open the door. The room fell silent as heads turned toward me, the weight of their stares sharp and unforgiving. These weren't strangers, they were Alexander and Madeline's mutual friends, a tight TO-10 one-knit circle I had never truly been a part of. From the moment Madeline had left Alexander to pursue her dreams abroad, I had stepped into the void she left behind. To them, I was an intruder, a placeholder for someone irreplaceable. Their cold hostility had been a constant shadow, their contempt an unspoken verdict. Once, their disdain would have sent me retreating into the safety of silence, but not tonight. Tonight, I walked forward, each step deliberated, each breath steady, until I stood before Alexander at the center of the crowd. Madeline's gaze met mine, her lips curling into a mocking smile. She moved as if to step away, but Alexander stopped her with ease. His arm tightened around her waist, pulling her back into his embrace. His hand was possessive and unyielding, drawing a soft, playful laugh from her lips. The sound was like shards of glass piercing through the fragile armor around my heart. One pain surged through me, sharp and unrelenting, as though 1,000 needles had carved their mark deep within my chest. But I couldn't afford to let my emotions consume me now. Pushing aside their intimate gestures, I found my voice and spoke clearly. "Alexander, no matter how you feel about me now, I've loved you with all my heart for 10 years. If you postpone the wedding, I promise to walk away after it's over and never bother you again." For a decade, I had given him my everything, hoping that my love had carved even the smallest space in his heart. People whispered that I was nothing more than a stand-in for Madeline, a placeholder for the woman who had always been his first choice. But I had clung to the belief that I was more than that I mattered to him, even if she had returned. 2. I had always been waiting for a word from Alexander. I refused to let go as long as he didn't say it, no matter how others mocked or humiliated me. Stubbornly, I remained by his side, pouring all my love and devotion into him, hoping it would one day mean something. But this time, the wedding forced me to face the truth. He had made his choice long ago. I had just been too blind to see it. He often said he liked obedient, quiet girls. So, I was always reserved, accommodating, and docile in front of him. But Madeline didn't need to be any of those things. She could be willful and demanding, and Alexander would still defend her every whim. All his indulgence and care were hers, while all his doubt, impatience, and coldness were mine. He gave a faint smile and said, "Scarlett, do you think it's absurd to say something like that? Think about it. Ever since Madeline came back, what have you done? You hired thugs to kidnap her, spread rumors about her to being the other woman, and even plotted to have someone run her down with a car. You'll do anything to cling to me, and now you're telling me you let go. Do you think I'd believe that?" As his accusations struck one after another, my chest tightened, suffocating under a weight that felt like damp cotton. Breathing became a struggle. I had heard these words too many times before. Since Madeline's return, incident after incident had chipped away at Alexander's trust in me too. He had grown tired, constantly lecturing me how to behave. But the truth was, I had been the one kidnapped. I hadn't fueled the trending rumors, and even the car accident was a trap set by Madeline herself. Instinctively, I opened my mouth to protest, to explain that none of it was my doing. But Madeline's mocking eyes, and the sneering faces of his friends stopped me in my tracks. What was the point? No matter how often I defended myself, it wouldn't change a thing. Alexander, he would never believe me. Seeing my silence, Madeline laughed sweetly and stepped forward, turning to Alexander. "Alexander, her mother is dying. You shouldn't break your promise even if you were angry at her for hurting me. Maybe I should skip my birthday celebration this time. She's nothing compared to you," Alexander replied, his gaze brushing over me with cold indifference. Madeline's words gave me a fleeting glimmer of hope, only for Alexander to crush it with his dismissive tone. Madeline lightly tapped his chest, her voice sweet and teasing. "Alexander, don't be like that. After all, she spent 10 years by your side for my sake." She turned to me, her feigned innocence barely masking her malice. "How about this, then? If you kneel down now, apologize for everything you've done to me, and drink these 10 bottles of alcohol, I'll persuade Alexander to attend your wedding as planned. Does that sound fair?" I looked at Alexander, searching his face for even a trace of disagreement. But he said nothing. His silence spoke louder than 2 words. It was his way of agreeing. The image of my mother's hopeful gaze flashed through my mind. Gritting my teeth, I lowered my head and began to kneel. But just as my knees bent, Madeline's smile widened. She casually grabbed several wine bottles and smashed them on the floor, scattering sharp shards across my path. Wearing a knee-length dress, I didn't need to imagine the damage those jagged edges would inflict. The atmosphere was suffocating, thick with unspoken tension. As I resolved to go through with it, Alexander's cold voice cut through the silence. "Enough, Madeline. You can't even handle the sight of blood." Madeline's face darkened, her displeasure evident, but she dared not challenge him. I let out a bitter smile. Why was I still clinging to hope, even now? Shifting my gaze to the bottles of alcohol on the table, I locked eyes with Alexander. "If I finish all of this, you'll attend the wedding as promised, won't you?" His expression flickered, a rare trace of hesitation. "Scarlett, have you forgotten you're allergic to alcohol?" A faint, bitter smile tugged at my lips. "Spare me your concern, Alexander. Just keep your word." 3 After speaking, I cracked open the first bottle of liquor and downed it in one go. The fiery burn scorched my throat, forcing an uncontrollable cough to escape me. Across from me, Alexander's expression hardened further, his eyes growing colder. He clenched his jaw and barked my name sharply. To make sure he didn't back out, I gritted my teeth and endured the burning discomfort of my allergy. By the time I reached the 3rd bottle, I could barely stand, my body leaning heavily against the table for support. Seeing this, Madeline moved closer. "Scarlett, if you can't drink anymore, why don't we just forget this whole thing?" The familiar scent of sage filled my senses, 3 wrapping around me like a haunting memory. The same scent clung to Alexander countless nights when he returned home late. I recoiled instinctively from her touch. I raised a trembling hand, but she stumbled backward. Without hesitation, Alexander caught her, his concern evident in the way he looked at her. In the chaos, I lost my balance and fell to the ground. The alcohol spun my head, but the sharp sting of pain snapped me back to reality. My hands hit the shards of broken glass on the floor, and a long piece pierced deep into my palm, blood flowing freely. At the sight of it, Madeline gasped, collapsing into Alexander's arms. As I watched him prepare to leave, Madeline clinging to him, I ignored the pain and crawled toward him, my fingers gripping the hem of his pants. Alexander, you promised me. There are still 7 bottles left. I'll finish them. He looked down at me, his gaze thick with disdain. Stop this, Scarlett. I thought you'd learned by now after all this time being ignored. But here you are, still stubborn. You even went so far as to have your mother fake her death to force me into marriage. Let me make it clear, Madeline's birthday is in 3 days. Even if your mother really is dying, she'll have to wait until after Madeline's day is over. With those words, he turned and walked away without sparing me another glance. Madeline's friends rushed to her side, but I was left there, alone and broken, lying in despair. My allergy made breathing harder with each passing second. In my desperation, I dialed a number. When I woke, I could feel the cold for fluid seeping into my veins, the steady drip a reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. My hands were wrapped in bandages, and my best friend sat by my bedside, her face etched with worry. As soon as I saw her, I lost all control. My voice came out hoarse and weak. Amanda. She pulled me into her arms, her embrace tight with worry and love. Through her tears, she scolded me, blaming me for not taking care of myself. The doctor had told her that if she'd arrived even 10 minutes later, I could suffocated from the allergic reaction. Once the tears slowed and I could breathe again, I told her everything that had happened with Alexander. Her fury flared, her voice rising angrily, filling the sterile hospital room. I stayed silent, unable to say anything. The doctor had been sending me messages, one after another, about my mother's worsening condition. I'd always known this day would come. The end was near for her. The only thing keeping her alive was her hope, her desire to see me happy. And yet, I couldn't even give her that simple wish. Amanda looked at me carefully, her voice gentle as she probed, "Do you still remember Tristan? He's waited for you all these years." The image of his gentle, refined face flashed in my mind. Our moments together had been few and far between, but I hadn't forgotten him. She continued before I could process her words, "If Alexander refuses, then we will find someone else. We can't let Auntie leave with regrets." Without waiting for my response, my impulsive best friend dialed Tristan Walker's number. My heart leaped into my throat. The idea seemed absurd, but it was my last glimmer of hope. When I heard his warm, nervous voice on the other end of the line, saying, "Okay," I couldn't hold it in any longer. I broke down, tears spilling uncontrollably, for my best friend held me tightly, her hand gently patting my back as she whispered words of comfort. After the 4 drip, I felt better, the haze in my mind lifting and my thoughts turning to my mother. I needed to be with her. As we stepped out of the hospital room, my best friend flashed me a confident smile. "Don't worry, Scarlett. In 3 days, you'll be the most beautiful bride." Her words barely left her lips when I saw Alexander standing before us, his expression dark and unreadable. The moment my best friend caught sight of him, she rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath, "Jerk." I ignored her and locked eyes with Alexander, who turned his cold gaze toward me. "For Scarlett, my patience is running thin. This is your last warning. 3 days from now, I won't be at your wedding." I met his gaze without flinching and replied, my voice sharp, "You've helped me in the past, but I've spent 10 years by your side. Now that Madeline is back, we re-even. I owe you nothing. As for the wedding, it doesn't need to be you standing at the altar." It was the first time I had spoken to him so coldly in 10 years. A flicker of unease flashed across Alexander's face, his heart skipping a beat. He parted his lips slightly, exhaling as if something had slipped beyond his control. But the man who had always held the reins of power in front of me quickly suppressed the unfamiliar stir of unease. Impatience flared in his eyes as he seized my injured hand, the pressure causing for fresh blood to seep through the bandages. Only then did he seem to notice the wound. "Your hand." Before I could reply, Madeline skipped out of the examination room. Alexander immediately released my hand and rushed to support her. "Why are you out here alone?" As he turned away, a cold sneer curled on his lips, his words dripping with disdain. "Scarlett, don't push your luck. Have I been too lenient, letting you use your mother's illness to manipulate me? Aren't you afraid you'll really curse her to death? You know I don't tolerate disobedient women. And you know I have 100 ways to make you behave." I watched his retreating figure, my words slipping from my lips in a whisper, "I don't like heartless, second-hand men for either." Street. Just as I stepped into the hospital, a text message from an unfamiliar number flashed on my phone. "I am in Finland. I'll make it back before the wedding. Leave everything to me. A sense of relief washed over me. Although the groom had changed, the wedding would still take place, and there was still so much to do. Between coordinating with makeup artists and caring for my mother, my days had become a blur. It wasn't until the wedding day itself that I truly understood the weight of Alexander's words. I have 100 ways to make you behave. To avoid any last-minute surprises, I arrived at the venue early to inspect the preparations but the sight before me left me stunned. The decorations were being taken down, and the last bouquet of flowers was pulled away right before my eyes. Panicking, I rushed to stop the worker. What's going on? I've already paid for everything. How can you cancel now? The worker gave me a pitying look and sighed. Miss, it's not that we want to cancel, but think about whether you've angered someone. It's not just us. I'm afraid no one in the entire city will dare handle your wedding now. We'll refund the breach of contract fee to your account. A ringing buzz filled my head, and everything around me blurred into nothingness. I slumped against the wall, feeling utterly helpless. It was Alexander but I couldn't make sense of it. I had already decided to leave him alone. Wasn't this exactly what he wanted? Why couldn't he just let me go? I thought about that as I hurried to the bridal shop. Inside, I saw Madeline in my custom-made wedding gown, a crown perched on her head, radiating the arrogance of a princess. Alexander stood beside her, gazing at her with eyes full of adoration. I turned to leave, but my gaze fell on the charm necklace around her neck, the one that belonged to Alexander. That charm had been something my mother had earned through years of bowing, each step taken with the weight of her frail body dragging her through the pain. They didn't deserve to wear it. I stepped forward, extending my hand toward Madeline. Hand it over. Madeline immediately clutched her neck, protectively, glancing at Alexander with a look of feigned helplessness. He stepped in front of her, shielding her with a frown. It's just a worthless trinket. Today is Madeline's birthday. Don't make a scene. After today, if you want one, I'll get you as many as you want. My eyes burned, stinging with the threat of tears. When my mother had entrusted the charm to him, he'd promised to protect it. But to him, it was nothing more than a worthless trinket. Behind him, Madeline raised her brows at me, smug and victorious. I couldn't hold back any longer. My hand shot out, grabbing for the charm around her neck. As I yanked it free, fresh scratches marred Madeline's delicate skin, blood trickling from the marks. I no longer wanted the second-hand dress. Or the second-hand man. All I wanted was to leave with the charm. But the bodyguards blocked my path. Alexander leaned down to comfort the crying Madeline. Hand it over now, and I'll pretend none of this ever happened. Madeline stomped her foot, frustration bubbling over. Alexander, she hurt me. And you're just going to let her get away with it. With a cold glance in her direction, Alexander silenced her. I remained silent, clutching the charm tightly against my chest. His patience, once so enduring, finally snapped. Step by step, he approached me. The bodyguards pinned me down, and the charm around my neck was ripped away. He casually tossed both charms into Madeline's hands. If you still want to marry me, behave yourself. Madeline smirked wickedly, lighting a lighter in her hand. What should I do? I suddenly don't care for it as much anymore. No. I shook my head, desperation flooding through me. Before my eyes, the last vestige of my mother's protection turned to ash in her hands. Anger roared through me. Madeline, I'll kill you. I struggled, but the bodyguards held me firmly in place. I turned my hateful gaze on Alexander. Alexander, why do you treat me like this? Was it wrong to love you with everything I had? Even if I was wrong, I've already given up on you. Why are you still doing this to me? Why was he so determined to destroy my hopes, refusing to help me fulfill my mother's final wish? Something in my expression seemed to reach him, piercing through his cold exterior. The hatred in my eyes caused a rare flicker of confusion to cloud his face. In his memories, whenever I looked at him, my eyes had always been filled with love and adoration. Unconsciously, he moved closer. But Madeline quickly stepped forward, wrapping herself around his arm. Let's go. The guests are waiting for us. He turned and walked away with Madeline, leaving me standing there, abandoned and broken. I collapsed onto the ground, helplessness and despair crashing over me like an unforgiving wave. The wedding decorations were gone. The wedding dress was gone. Even the charm my mother had so carefully obtained for me was gone. Even if Tristan made it back in time, I knew my mother would sense something was wrong. In the end, I had changed nothing. I wandered the streets, lost in a fog, letting the rain drench me completely. Out of nowhere, a black umbrella appeared above my head, and a soft voice spoke beside me. Weren't you supposed to get married today? Why are you out here, crying all alone? Sitting in the car, I finally recognized Tristan, though his face was unfamiliar. He took off his coat and draped it over my shoulders. The warmth of the fabric chased away chill deep inside me. I gave him a small, apologetic smile. Sorry, Tristan. Looks like the wedding won't be happening after all. After all, the wedding venue was ruined, and Madeline had taken the dress. With only 2 hours left before the auspicious hour, pulling everything together in time was impossible. Hearing this, Tristan's gentle expression darkened. What happened? As I explained the situation, his tense features softened. He smiled, leading me to another venue. From a distance, I could see my mother being looked after by 2 professional caregivers. Though her sight had failed her, her spirit seemed unusually bright that day. I turned back in surprise. How is this possible? Tristan smiled, looking warmly in his eyes, as if he wanted to pat my head but stopped himself at the last moment. Forgive me for being forward, but I've been waiting a long time for this day. He led me to a room where makeup artists were already waiting. There, hanging quietly, was a breathtaking wedding dress. I stared at it, momentarily lost in its beauty. Tristan's makeup artist's cousin smiled knowingly when she saw my gaze on the dress. Tristan refused to date or marry for years, but he bought this dress without hesitation. Looks like he was waiting for the one he truly wanted. I stood there confused, fragmented memories flashing through my mind. But there was no time to linger on them as the soft strains of the wedding march began to fill the hall. Tristan and I walked to the stage together, our hands intertwined with the matching knots my mother had made elsewhere. Alexander was immersed in the celebration of Madeline's birthday, surrounded by friends. Yet, no matter how lively the party was, the image of my hate-filled gaze refused to leave his mind. A man of power, he loathed anything that disrupted his composure. Even though he buried it deep, the unease in his heart wouldn't fade. Without warning, he pulled away from the circle, sang around Madeline, and dialed his assistant. Keep a close watch on Scarlett. Don't let her stir up trouble. His assistant's voice said reassuringly, Don't worry, President Adams. Miss 61 Carter is getting married today. She won't have time to interfere with the birthday party you arranged for Miss Landers. XXX. The wedding ceremony was a prolonged affair. Even though my mother couldn't see, she continued smiling in my direction. Finally, I could put her mind at ease. With tears welling in my eyes, I stood before her and vowed to live a happy life. But just as we reached the ring exchange, Alexander stormed in, flanked by a group of his people. The commotion disturbed my mother, whose face, despite her frail state, was uncharacteristically animated in her final moments. Alexander's voice was a low, menacing growl. Scarlett, how dare you marry someone else? He turned his gaze to my mother, whose eyes, despite their blindness, seemed unusually bright. You said your mother was gravely ill, and that this wedding was her dying wish. Does she look like someone who's about to pass? Did you trick me here for amusement? Ignoring his outburst, he reached for my hand, but Tristan stepped forward, blocking his path. I lifted my wedding dress and ran to my mother, who had suddenly lost consciousness. Mom, I cried, but there was no response. A single tear slid down from the corner of her eye. We had been so close. So close. The medical staff rushed to her side and began emergency treatment. Tears streamed uncontrollably down my face. As I passed Alexander, I slapped him hard across the face, my voice choked with fury. Alexander, I hate you. I hate you. I hate you. After shouting, I followed the medical team to the hospital. Alexander leaned silently against the wall outside the emergency room, his face ashen. I was trembling all over, and Tristan tried to comfort me with a gentle pat on my shoulder. But Alexander rushed over and shoved him away. Don't touch her. I lifted my head, my eyes swollen and red from the endless tears. Summoning every ounce of strength, I shoved Alexander away. Alexander, who do you think you are? What right do you have to say any of this? My mother, my only support, couldn't even find peace in her final moments because of your endless cruelty. Are you satisfied now? Tears streamed down my face once more, unstoppable. Alexander despised when women cried, always finding it a nuisance. So in the past, no matter how intense my emotions were, I buried them deep, dealing with everything alone. But now, the seething hatred in my heart made me want to tear him apart. The air outside the emergency room was thick with tension. Tristan held my hand tightly, offering silent strength. Alexander's eyes remained fixed on our intertwined hands. His face darkened, but he stayed silent, his anger simmering beneath the surface. Then, the emergency room doors opened. The doctor met my eyes and shook his head, regret in his expression. I rushed into the room. My body nearly collapsed, and Tristan caught me, his arms strong around me as the tears flowed. My mother reached out weakly, grasping my hand, and the weight of the pain in my chest was unbearable. Through my sobs, I kept whispering, "I'm sorry." After my father's untimely death, my mother raised me alone, doing everything she could to shield me from suffering. Her only wish had always been for me to find happiness. But I had failed her, and now, the weight of that failure crushed me as I cried uncontrollably. My mother, her eyes brimming with tears, gently cupped my face in her hands. "Scarlett, don't cry. I know the man standing by your side today isn't Alexander," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I trust you, my dear. I believe Tristan will treat you well. Mom is happy." At that moment, I learned that Tristan had knelt by my mother's bedside for an entire night before the wedding, vowing his love and commitment to me. My mother placed my hand in Tristan's and closed her eyes, a peaceful smile touching her lips. At the doorway, Alexander stood, watching the scene unfold with a pale, stunned expression. I didn't acknowledge him. As I passed, he reached out and grabbed my hand, his voice thick with regret. "Scarlett, I really didn't know your mother was this ill. Madeline has a doctor friend who told me your mother wasn't in any immediate danger, but I for once." Alexander, the man usually so proud and composed, was stumbling over his words, trying to explain himself. I should have felt something, perhaps even a sense of vindication. But all I felt at that moment was scorn. I wrenched my hand away. "So what? Does it really matter now? This isn't about what you didn't know, it's about what you never cared to understand." Alexander, when you chose to believe Madeline instead of me, everything between us ended completely. His tall frame swayed slightly, and he frowned, clearly confused. "Does it matter so much whether I believed you? I never truly blamed you. It wasn't until the clock struck midnight that my mother took her final breath. Deep in my heart, I knew it was her last act of love for me. She didn't want my wedding anniversary to also be the anniversary of her death. Throughout her illness, she had gently prepared me for this moment, ensuring I wouldn't be consumed by grief when the time came. Standing before her grave, I clutched Tristan's hand tightly in return. Alexander appeared only once during the funeral, lighting incense for her, and then vanished, never to be seen again. Once everything was settled, I turned to Tristan and finally poured out all the doubts that had been gnawing at me. Like what his cousin had said, like the wedding dress, and what my best friend had mentioned about him remaining pure for me. As I spoke, Tristan's ears flushed crimson. He met my gaze with a sincerity that melted my heart and, with a quiet sigh, took out a stack of weathered letters from a safe. The maple leaf emblem on them was unmistakable. I knew those letters well. When my mother first fell ill, I was 7, overwhelmed, drowning under pressure, struggling to stand on my own. It was during the darkest, most painful time of my life that I received a letter. 8. The letters had been a steady source of encouragement before the memories could fully resurface. The sound of a violin echoed around me. The familiar melody wrapped around me like an old, comforting blanket, pulling me back to my university days so long ago. Back then, on countless evenings of practice, a beautiful violin tune always seemed to accompany my playing, a perfect harmony. But life had other plans. I had to drop out of school to care for my mother and eventually met Alexander. At the time, something urgent came up at home. I meant to resolve it quickly and come back to you. But when I returned, Alexander was already by your side. "You've always been one to repay 8 kindness," and I realized then I was too late. You can't imagine how thrilled I was when Amanda called and asked if I'd marry you. "I've waited all these years for you. So, Scarlett, would you give me a chance?" My heart pounded in my chest, wild and uncontrolled. The feeling completely differed from the hesitation and restraint I had felt in Alexander's presence. Now, I felt as if I were drowning in the warmth of Tristan's gaze. "Tristan," my cheeks flamed as he leaned in closer, and I instinctively looked away. He smiled gently, his hand resting softly on the top of my head. "It's okay, Scarlett. We'll take things slow." Tristan's kindness and respect made me feel a sense of ease I'd never known with Alexander. The Walker family's influence rivaled that of the Adams family. Tristan had rushed back to me unprepared, but now he stood by me, protecting me like a shield. One evening, I even saw Alexander's missing person announcement on the television. But despite the buzz, he never appeared before me. Instead, a flood of unfamiliar calls began pouring in. It wasn't hard to guess who they were from. In the end, I had no choice but to change my number. 8. Tristan shared that he was setting up a new international business chain. He asked if I would be interested in going abroad with him, and he offered to help me enroll in a university overseas so I could finally finish the education I had once given up. Music had always been my first love, but I had abandoned it for my mother's sake. His offer tugged at my heart, and without hesitation, I agreed. Then, Alexander finally found me. His once robust frame, kept in shape by a disciplined lifestyle, was now a mere shadow of its former self. The gray trench coat, which had once draped perfectly over his tall, elegant form, now hung off him like a ragged curtain. On his third day, standing outside my apartment, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I went downstairs to meet him, hoping to spare the neighbors from the sight. Tristan had offered to come with me, but I reassured him with a soft pat on his hand. The Addams family's influence was undeniable. Recently, in a desperate attempt to force Tristan to surrender me, they had gone against the Walker family at every turn. Tristan never spoke of it, but I knew how much he had already sacrificed for me. I didn't want to drag him into any more battles. When Alexander saw me, he crushed his cigarette underfoot, the smoke curling into the air. I couldn't help but flinch at the sight of the ground scattered with cigarette butts. In my memories, Alexander had always been a man of remarkable self-discipline. "Scarlett, you're finally willing to see me," he said, his voice carrying a weight that I had long grown tired of. His name alone had too much power, and I didn't want the attention of cameras snapping away at us. So we found a quiet cafe away from prying eyes. He ordered me an Americano, but I didn't take a sip. Not even a taste. "It's your favorite," he remarked, his eyes searching mine. I let out a bitter laugh. The one who loved black Americanos had always been him. Out of a sense of gratitude, I had once agreed to be with him, molding myself to fit his every need. I used to prepare a black Americano for him each morning, my love for him wrapped in the ritual of it. But now, I wasn't sure if my feelings had ever been loved or if they had simply been a mask for gratitude. "9. What exactly do you want from me?" I didn't feel like wasting words on him. The cold indifference in my eyes made his pupils constrict. He couldn't understand how we had ended up like this. At first, he simply thought that after Madeline returned, I'd become as obedient as I once was. So he had used her to provoke me, hoping it would keep me in line. But after all, he was far too busy to give much attention to a woman. He was so certain of my love for him that he never considered the possibility of me leaving. Now, explaining everything felt more difficult than sealing a billion-dollar deal. 9. I waited for him to speak, but my patience quickly ran out. There was so much I needed to do to prepare for studying abroad. When he saw me start to rise, panic flashed in his eyes. He grabbed my wrist tightly as if holding on would somehow keep me from disappearing. It wasn't until I winced in pain that he finally loosened his grip, muttering, "I'm sorry." I smirked, the corners of my lips curling. Well, the mighty president actually apologizing to me. Should I feel honored, accept it gratefully, and say, "It's okay, just to make you feel better"? I raised my hand, showing the faint scar still tinged pink, and spoke slowly, word by word. "Unfortunately, I don't accept it. And for the record, I don't want to see 9 you. Stop troubling Tristan. If you have even the slightest shred of conscience, leave me alone." With that, I turned without a second glance, walking away without hesitation. But after 2 steps, I was suddenly pulled into a strong embrace from behind. "Scarlett, I love you. Don't treat me like this." The once mighty man buried his head in my neck, his voice trembling as if on the brink of tears. The discovery took me by surprise enough that I didn't push him away right away. "We've had a misunderstanding. Let me explain. I admit I didn't think of your feelings before. I blindly believed Madeline's words. But it was only because I thought you did those things because you loved me. It made me happy. I never 9 blamed you, and you were never a substitute. You were always the one I loved. After everything you said last time, I finally realized my mistake. I didn't know they had treated you like that behind my back. Scarlett, can you forgive me?" As for the wedding, it was because Madeline's parents died saving me on her birthday. She asked me to celebrate it for her. At that time, the doctor told me your mother wasn't in immediate danger. Believe me, Scarlett, if I had known what would happen, I would have chosen you without hesitation. Hearing his words, a bitter ache spread through my chest, making it hard to breathe. Without thinking, I splashed the iced Americano right into his face. As he stared at me, shock and a flicker of anger in his eyes, I couldn't help but sneer. "Can't handle this? Well, thanks to your blindness, I've been through it all countless times. When we first got together, Alexander had shielded me, and everyone in our circle treated me like royalty. But everything changed after the incident with Madeline. At first, I fought tooth and nail to clear my name, dragging my bruised body to defend myself and even calling the police. But with a single dismissive line, "Stop making a scene," Alexander nailed me to a pillar of shame. I became the joke, the one everyone laughed at. And then, one incident after another, Madeline's schemes were as obvious as daylight. Even a child could see through them. 9, but Alexander always stood by her side. All those moments that once kept me awake, tormented by a constant ache. 10 I used to think Madeline was just too cunning, and his friends played along too well, which was why he was deceived. In my heart, I had made countless excuses for him. But now he was here, telling me that all those incidents were insignificant and that he had felt joy deep inside. Fury flared within me, and I slapped him hard. Alexander, do you honestly think that because you apologize and lower your head, I'll just forgive you? Stop dreaming. What about all the pain I've suffered? Was I just supposed to accept it? And let me make this clear, no matter how often you say sorry, it doesn't change a thing. I will never forgive you. 10. Without sparing him a second glance, I turned on my heel and walked away, leaving him to stand there, ashen-faced. Outside the door, Tristan's fists were clenched tightly, his face etched with seriousness. But as soon as he saw me, his expression softened, warmth filling his eyes. It was clear that he had witnessed everything. Without asking a single question, he simply reached out, took my hand, and said, "Let's go home." I dove headfirst into cramming for my spoken English and preparing for my admissions interview. Meanwhile, Alexander didn't come looking for me. But the news was flooded with updates about Adams Corporation's ruthless crackdown on Willow Creek Enterprises. 10. The entire city of Brookhaven was buzzing with tension. In less than a month, Adams Corporation had taken down several companies. Each time he destroyed one, someone was forced to step forward and apologize. People began to whisper that he was waging war in a fit of fury for a woman. The ironic part, he never let me step into the media spotlight. Instead, Madeline was often seen by his side, leading everyone to believe she was the woman behind it all. It wasn't until the Landers family was finally ruined and Madeline appeared before the media with a hollow gaze, apologizing for everything, that the truth came to light. The woman who had pushed Alexander to such extremes wasn't Madeline at all. I recognized the people he had gone after. 10. The same ones who bullied me. Yet, I couldn't grasp what he was trying to prove. The one who had caused me the most pain had always been him. I grew tired of it all and focused on my own life. During this time, unfamiliar phone calls flooded in. I accidentally picked up one, only to hear one of his friends sobbing, pleading for mercy, saying Alexander was determined to ruin them all, driving them out of Brookhaven. For the people who had hurt me in the past, no matter how pitiful their pleas sounded, I felt no sympathy. So, I chose to ignore them. That was until the day I was set to leave the country. 10. Tristan naturally held my hand, his presence now something I was growing accustomed to with each passing day. But as I was about to board the plane, the airport suddenly became engulfed by a crowd. Alexander rushed toward me, his face twisted in panic. His eyes were bloodshot, veins of red coursing through them. In his hands, he clutched 2 amulets of peace, relics from the church my mother had visited before she passed. Only then did I notice the swelling on his forehead, a reminder of the chaos that had unfolded. He staggered toward me, each step unsteady. Tristan instinctively positioned himself in front of me, his body tense and vigilant. But Alexander ignored him, stubbornly. 10. Holding out the amulets, his voice pleading. "Scarlett, I brought the amulets back. Don't go with him. Please, I know you're just with him to spite me. You've loved me for 10 years, how could you just stop loving me like this?" His voice trembled with desperation. Then, with a shocking move, he dropped to his knees in front of me, clutching my legs, just as I had once begged him not to delay our wedding. Tristan's back stiffened at the sight, his usually gentle eyes now darkened with a simmering intensity. I placed a reassuring hand on his back. And then, I did something that stunned everyone in the airport. 11. With one swift kick, I sent Alexander crashing to the ground, his grip on my leg no match for the force. I snatched the amulets from his trembling hands, a bitter smile curling my lips as I tore them apart piece by piece. His lips quivered, his eyes wide with disbelief, unable to comprehend what he was witnessing. I looked at him, cold and unmoved. "Alexander, once I loved you with all my heart, but you stomped on that love, deceived me, humiliated me. And now, you refuse to let me go when I've let go. Pathetic." The words hit him hard, and he staggered back, stunned. Before he could find his voice, I reached for Tristan's hand, intertwining our fingers, standing firmly at his side. 11. "And who told you I'm with him just to get back at you? If we're talking about love, the person I truly love is him, not you. To you, I feel nothing but gratitude. Alexander, don't make me despise you." In the midst of our confrontation, I hadn't even noticed when Tristan had sent a discreet message to the bodyguards from the Walker family. Soon, we were escorted safely into the airport, leaving Alexander's anguished screams fading into the distance behind us. I paid him no mind, my attention solely on Tristan, who still held my hand, his grip reassuring. I knew, without a doubt, that the future awaiting me would be one of true happiness.